For decades, a sealed chamber beneath Windsor Castle was dismissed as ceremonial lore until now. Princess Anne, in a move no one foresaw, descended into the archives and emerged carrying documents wrapped in Queen Elizabeth II's personal seal. What they contained would stun the monarchy and shatter the illusion of equilibrium at the heart of the royal family. This was no ordinary rediscovery, this was a weapon forged in silence and sealed by a monarch anticipating a storm. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne had always been known as the most duty-bound of the Windsors, but even her closest allies were taken aback by the gravity of what she carried. With the obsidian key in her hand once belonging to the Queen Mother, she unlocked a chamber untouched since 2002, a space few even knew existed beneath the East Terrace. Inside, dust-covered crates bore the sigil of Elizabeth Regina and were bound in velvet ties marked with wax seals. Within one crate, Anne uncovered a folder stamped Project Clarion, a title whispered only among the Queen's most trusted aides in her final decade. What lay within wasn't a memoir or a personal letter. It was a series of constitutional documents drafted and signed in Elizabeth's unmistakable handwriting, outlining reforms that no reigning monarch had dared to voice aloud. And at the center of it all was one name, Catherine. These were not sentimental reflections. They were legal and strategic instruments, clauses written with sharp intent, enabling Catherine, Princess of Wales, to wield powers previously reserved for sovereign rulers. According to the pages, these documents had been meant for posthumous activation, but they had never reached their intended destination. Whether by oversight or design, they had remained hidden until Anne's intervention. Palace insiders were immediately rattled. Anne's sudden emergence from the vault with classified state-bound documents caused whispers of overreach, even betrayal. But she had not acted out of impulse. The documents bore instructions clear, dated, and deliberate, naming her as the designated hand to bring them forth should the nation enter a phase of monarchical uncertainty. Now, with King Charles' health faltering and internal divisions deepening, Anne had judged the moment ripe. The implications were seismic. Catherine was no longer a symbolic figurehead in waiting. Elizabeth's words had elevated her into something altogether different, an active participant in the state's continuity, with safeguards and reach that challenged the monarchy's status quo. The Queen had prepared her quietly, and now, through Anne, her final chess move had been made. But this revelation was only the first tremor. The true quake came with what those documents authorized and who they directly overrode. Buried within the yellowing pages was an explosive clause, the Catherine Directive, a set of provisions granting the Princess of Wales constitutional latitude no consort had ever held. It wasn't just honorary recognition. It was power. Strategic, political, legal. And it sent ripples through Buckingham Palace that threatened to split the inner circle in two. The clause, nestled between meticulously scripted advisory texts, spoke with a clarity that bordered on defiant. It stated without ambiguity that Catherine, as civic sovereign representative, held not just influence, but intervention rights in matters concerning national unity and ceremonial continuity during times of institutional ambiguity. In essence, if the monarch was incapacitated or otherwise unable to command the full apparatus of constitutional leadership, Catherine would step in not as a placeholder, but as a decision-maker. This was not a vague gesture of goodwill or a ceremonial nicety. It was an instruction from the late Queen, wrapped in sovereign authority, intended to outlive her reign and activate in crisis. What made the revelation even more electric was what, or rather who, was missing. Nowhere in these documents was Camilla mentioned, not once. No title, no suggestion of equivalence, no shared duty. Her absence was deafening. For the Queen to omit her daughter-in-law so thoroughly in a document of such legal and constitutional magnitude signaled not just preference, but intention. This was the true shock. The sovereign had chosen a path divergent from what the public had been led to believe. Behind palace walls, the atmosphere shifted. William, caught in the tightening grip of legacy and loyalty, understood immediately what had been placed before him. He was not blindsided, but the clarity of his mother's intentions shook even his steady composure. He had suspected Elizabeth's admiration for Catherine had gone beyond admiration into trust, but now he had physical proof. Still, with power of this nature, questions needed to be answered. Constitutional scholars were contacted in hushed tones. Legal analysts, many retired or quietly retained by the Crown, began assessing the clauses for their enforceability. The document had the late Queen's seal, her unmistakable signature, and a paper trail tying it back to Windsor's royal archive. And yet, even within its authenticity, it threatened to trigger constitutional discussions that no one in the current monarchy wanted to have. If enacted, Catherine's directive would place her above traditional consort roles into uncharted territory. It wasn't about ruling, it was about guiding a monarchy through turbulent times with unprecedented authority. The palace had long treated Catherine as the future, but this directive revealed she was already something much closer to the present. But as news of these clauses reached Clarence House, a figure long overshadowed was thrust into the spotlight. Camilla's silence was not passive, it was strategic. Camilla's expression at the council table revealed nothing, but her operatives were already mobilized. Leaks to favored journalists, sudden meetings with Commonwealth delegates, and covert appeals to senior dukes suggested a counter-narrative was brewing. Camilla would not be displaced quietly, nor would she accept a dead queen's final maneuver without deploying her own. Within hours of the Catherine directive surfacing, Camilla's inner circle initiated a sweeping counteraction, framing the documents as speculative, outdated, and constitutionally ambiguous. Senior royal traditionalists, many long loyal to the late Queen Mother's lineage, were discreetly summoned to Clarence House. Over tea and silence, Camilla made her pitch. The monarchy had survived not because of sudden interventions, but through tradition, and these documents, she insisted, jeopardized the very fabric of that tradition. Behind the scenes, her legal team dissected the clauses line by line, arguing that Elizabeth's intentions had never passed through ratified constitutional procedure. They branded the directive an unendorsed memo, positioning it as a deeply personal but legally inert expression of sentiment, not a binding shift in power. Their message was clear. Catherine had received symbolic favor, not structural elevation. But as Camilla launched her strategic offensive, the family around her began to fracture. Zara Tyndall, both a granddaughter of the Queen and niece to Anne, found herself in a painful bind. Her loyalty to her mother clashed with her pragmatic respect for Catherine's growing influence. Prince Edward, long the silent stabilizer within the House of Windsor, avoided public alignment, but was reported to have expressed concern over the Queen Consort's tone of retaliation. Meanwhile, whispers in royal corridors suggested that Camilla's accusations of favoritism toward Catherine were igniting discomfort. The Queen Consort's aides began framing Catherine's prominence as manufactured, the result of calculated grooming rather than innate merit. Yet, this move proved risky. Public sympathy still leaned heavily toward the Princess of Wales, and accusations of orchestration only amplified Catherine's image as a woman burdened by destiny, not ambition. In a symbolic show of strength, Camilla's schedule was doubled. Patronage events were stacked, high-visibility walkabouts arranged, photo opportunities maximized. From veterans' charities to heritage foundations, her presence surged. But even as she moved with resolve through ribbon cuttings and engagements, palace insiders noted an unmistakable edge in her voice behind closed doors, particularly when tensions with William erupted over the handling of the documents. Heated exchanges were rumored. William, protective of both his wife and his mother's sealed intent, was said to have challenged Camilla's authority in a rare, direct confrontation. For a family raised in restraint, this was a rupture few could ignore. Camilla, however, was not retreating. Every move she made, every whisper she circulated, was an attempt to remind the monarchy and its global observers that she was not merely the wife of a king but a queen in her own right. But while palace operatives scrambled for ground, Catherine herself remained unshaken, and her silence was not retreat, but preparation. She was always measured, always gracious, but this time, Catherine didn't wait for permission. With cameras rolling at a charity gala, she gave a carefully worded speech, referencing dormant legacies reawakening. It wasn't subtle, and those in the know understood. This was the beginning of her power claim. The gloves were off, and the future queen had spoken. The audience applauded the elegance of her delivery, but the undertone wasn't lost on the monarchy's inner circle. Her choice of language echoed the phrasing in the sealed documents uncovered by Anne, phrases only a few had seen but now echoed from a public stage. In that moment, Catherine had crossed the threshold from passive consort to public catalyst. No advisors had cleared that line, no palace official had signed off on it, and yet, she said it with the full weight of someone who knew she could. Even more striking was the emerald brooch pinned to her gown, a royal artifact belonging to Queen Victoria herself. It had been unofficially kept from consorts, regarded as an heirloom reserved for reigning monarchs or their designated heirs. For Catherine to wear it in such a moment, and in such a setting, was not an accident. It was a message, one of inheritance, of authority, and of sanctioned rebellion. Behind the scenes, her meetings with Princess Anne had become more regular and significantly more private. Anne, who once kept to tradition like armour, now appeared to be briefing Catherine with the type of quiet precision that only comes from the transfer of long-guarded knowledge. Their alliance, grounded not in convenience, but in strategy and shared duty, was reshaping the very centre of royal gravity. Days later, a vehicle carrying the Archbishop of Canterbury was seen pulling away from Kensington Palace under cover of night. No official statement followed. But those attuned to the old ways of royal transition knew this was never about coincidence. The Archbishop, keeper of the Church's conscience and constitutional balance, had entered Catherine's orbit. What was once theoretical was now operational. The Princess of Wales was no longer reacting, she was directing. Royal watchers began observing subtle shifts. Catherine at ceremonial rehearsals previously reserved for reigning monarchs, Catherine initiating updates to patronage governance, Catherine adjusting how official family briefings were delivered. She had entered the framework of power, not as a visitor, but as an architect. The pressure around her grew heavier, especially as Camilla abruptly cancelled a joint engagement without explanation. It was meant to be a moment of unity. Instead, it became a public symptom of internal fracture. Whispers of confrontation behind closed doors trickled into the media. What had started as symbolic strain had now become a political standoff, with Catherine commanding increasing support from institutional loyalists. Yet she never raised her voice. She didn't have to. Her silence was louder than any speech Camilla could give. Her calm was not submission, it was supremacy cloaked in grace. But while the royal women clashed in symbolism and silence, another force stirred from the shadows, one that could rewrite the entire succession structure. Summoned behind locked doors, Princess Anne delivered a private statement before the Crown Chamber, a seldom-used advisory council bound by oath to the reigning monarch. Her words, simple yet unshakable, asserted the Queen's willful clarity in drafting the Catherine documents. What followed was a royal reckoning that hadn't occurred since the days of King George VI. The Crown Chamber, a relic of royal constitutional oversight, had not been summoned in over 7 decades, but as the storm surrounding the Catherine Directive swelled into constitutional territory, the palace was left with no choice. 12 members, historians, archivists, and royal legalists gathered in hushed tension beneath the stone walls of the chamber. Anne entered not as a sister, nor a daughter, but as a bearer of legacy, and with a composed voice that cut through generations of silence, she stated what few dared to believe. Queen Elizabeth II had prepared these documents with full intent, instructed Anne personally to safeguard them, and issued guidance for their release only under exceptional strain. That moment, Anne declared, had come. Her testimony struck with the force of a royal decree, yet it was not enough for words alone to sway the guardians of tradition. The council turned to the pages themselves. Senior royal archivists, summoned days prior, provided critical verification. The Queen's signature, coded with her known security markers and rare cursive anomalies, matched those found in coronation decrees and wartime advisories. The evidence was unshakable, and yet, even in this clarity, the Crown Chamber fractured. Two members, both known loyalists to King Charles's more conventional interpretation of succession, resigned on the spot. They cited institutional misalignment and deviation from unifying protocol. Their absence sent a tremor through the chamber. The Queen's intentions had been authenticated, but whether they could be enacted without plunging the institution into internal civil war remained deeply uncertain. Hours later, Catherine was quietly informed of the chamber's verdict. The directive had received partial validation sufficient to stand as a legitimate advisory clause, yet not enough to bypass formal consent by reigning powers. It was a victory drenched in complexity. She had stepped into the realm of influence, but not without shadows trailing every step. And those shadows grew longer when Camilla, notably absent from the council proceedings, was not even summoned for questioning. The omission was interpreted less as an oversight and more as a declaration. The chamber had drawn its lines, and Camilla, for all her titles, stood on the periphery. The optics were brutal. A queen consort, ignored at a moment of national royal recalibration, was a statement in itself. Silence had become a weapon, and its use was precise. But even as the monarchy inched closer to Catherine's ascent, just as the fog of uncertainty began to lift, a stunning disruption emerged. A new set of documents, unsigned, undated, and riddled with contradiction, surfaced from the bowels of a different royal archive. They threatened to throw every hard-earned certainty back into chaos. And just when clarity seemed within reach, a new set of files, unsigned, undated, but devastating, surfaced to challenge everything. It was crimson, thick, and out of place, discovered in a private safe near Sandringham with no registry entry. The red folder, stamped only with a Windsor insignia, contained alternative directives, suggesting Elizabeth may have been reconsidering her stance on Catherine. Or was it a forgery planted to discredit the original clause? The palace was thrown into chaos. Word of its discovery sent tremors through the already fracturing institution. Inside were conflicting pages, some subtly undermining the Catherine directive, others implying a dual consort structure where governance would be shared between Catherine and Camilla. The wording was vague. There were no signatures, no dates, no official seals. And yet, the implications were staggering. If authentic, it suggested Elizabeth harbored second thoughts in her final years. If fabricated, it pointed to someone desperate enough to sabotage Catherine's legitimacy at any cost. Royal analysts and constitutional advisors were immediately divided. Some noted that the folder's language lacked the Queen's distinct phrasing and formality, raising questions about authorship. Others, more cautious, urged that royal archives from the Sandringham estate had historically included drafts never intended for circulation. But the timing was far too calculated to be coincidence. Just days after the Crown Chamber offered partial validation of Catherine's powers, this folder emerged like a planted minefield. Rumours swirled behind palace gates that Charles himself might have played a hand in commissioning its contents, not out of malice, but to buy time, to slow the momentum that was carrying his son and daughter-in-law toward an accelerated coronational destiny. If so, it would mark the first time a reigning monarch indirectly undercut a directive from his own mother. That suggestion alone was enough to send shockwaves through senior aides, many of whom began distancing themselves from any decision-making connected to the red folder. Catherine, when confronted with the circulating whispers, declined to comment. Her silence, already a tool of symbolism, now became a vacuum filled with speculation. Was she blindsided? Or had she already anticipated the emergence of resistance veiled in red paper? Her refusal to defend or deny lent her an aura of calm confidence or cold calculation, depending on which palace corridor one stood in. The press seized on her silence, turning it into a frenzy of speculation. And when reports surfaced that MI5 had been briefed on the possibility of tampering, the entire drama took on a new, chilling dimension. Had a forgery been planted inside a royal estate? Had intelligence agencies been watching this succession chessboard all along? The line between protocol and paranoia thinned by the hour. The monarchy stood suspended, caught between a verified past and a shadowy contradiction. Trust, already fragile, teetered on a knife's edge. For every insider who dismissed the folder as a manipulative fiction, another believed it to be a suppressed truth, and as private debates exploded into institutional alarm, one voice had yet to speak, the only voice powerful enough to settle the storm or ignite it. As the dust thickened around conflicting legacies, it was the king himself who finally broke his silence, and when he did, the entire monarchy held its breath. With solemn eyes and shaking hands, King Charles addressed the nation from the Blue Room. Flanked by portraits of his mother and heir, he acknowledged the existence of the documents, his knowledge of their intent, and his duty to protect both legacy and stability. But his final words were what stunned the world. The future lies not in one hand, but in the one she already holds. It was not the sweeping endorsement Catherine's supporters had hoped for, nor was it the dismissal that Camilla's allies had anticipated. Instead, it was a calibrated reckoning from a monarch standing at the crossroads of inheritance and upheaval. Charles confirmed that the documents, including the Catherine Directive, were authentic in origin and aligned with Elizabeth's long-standing personal reflections. Yet he also urged interpretive humility, cautioning against the literal application of words crafted in solitude for a future never guaranteed. In that statement, he cast doubt not on the Queen's intent, but on the rigidity with which it should now be applied. The king refused to name a victor in the silent war between his wife and his daughter-in-law. Instead, he pivoted to the institution itself, stating his desire to preserve unity above all else. But actions speak louder than neutrality. He announced the formation of a new transitional council tasked with balancing continuity and reform, led not by senior courtiers or hereditary peers, but by Princess Anne and Prince Edward. The symbolism was unmistakable. Anne, the custodian of Elizabeth's sealed vault, and Edward, the quiet architect of institutional calm, were now the bridge between the old order and the one taking shape. In a surprising stroke, Catherine was named Custodian of Royal Engagements, an unprecedented role that allowed her to oversee and recalibrate public-facing ceremonial duties across the Crown's global footprint. It was a title layered in diplomacy, but its authority was unmistakable. She now wielded the soft power of visibility, narrative, and symbolic direction. Camilla, however, retained her title as Queen Consort, but with a critical caveat. She would no longer attend sessions of the Crown Chamber, the very council where legacy is debated and power measured. It was a subtle yet brutal delineation. Camilla could remain the figure beside the throne, but she would not be part of shaping what came next. The speech divided the monarchy's orbit. Loyalists to Charles praised his balancing act, applauding his attempt to cool the embers of familial conflict. But critics, including several within the House of Lords, decried the lack of finality. Some called the compromise a stalling tactic in regal attire, while others warned that ambiguity would only deepen the fractures already exposed. And yet, behind the formality and pageantry, a single truth lingered: Charles had passed the burden of direction without ever declaring succession. He had acknowledged his mother's vision, empowered his sister's stewardship, and placed Catherine at the helm of visibility. But the reins of finality remained elusive, delicately suspended between past and present. Yet while the royal world debated the king's compromise, another announcement loomed, one that no one saw coming. Locked in the royal vault since May 2023, a ceremonial addendum signed just 48 hours before Charles's coronation surfaced, naming Catherine as heir regent in dormant conditions. A rarely used legal mechanism, it could elevate her role immediately should the king be deemed incapacitated. Suddenly, the palace was no longer discussing legacy, it was preparing for transfer. The discovery sent an irreversible signal through the heart of the monarchy. The framework for a quiet succession was already in place. Unlike the Catherine Directive, which had stirred debate over interpretation, this addendum bore current authority, clear, deliberate, and astonishing in scope. It invoked a dormant clause not used since the post-war crisis of 1952, when the sudden death of King George VI had left institutional ambiguity in its wake. Queen Elizabeth, at that time a young heir thrust into leadership, had later drafted a similar contingency in 1997, but it had remained sealed, unused. Now, with this modern echo, the monarchy confronted a chilling question. Had the Crown quietly acknowledged that Charles's reign might be shorter or more unstable than publicly admitted? The addendum itself was legally binding, its language crafted under the advisement of Princess Anne and signed directly by Charles in his final private audience before the coronation. It outlined the triggering conditions under which Catherine would assume executive authority, not as monarch, but as heir regent, empowered to guide constitutional processes and represent the Crown in ceremonial, diplomatic, and state matters should Charles be rendered unable to perform his duties. Crucially, it gave Catherine the right to summon and dissolve Crown Chamber councils, placing her above the advisory structures that had once tried to constrain her rise. Behind closed doors, there was no more ambiguity. Catherine was now seated directly beneath the throne, with the legal scaffolding to stand alone, should that moment come. Public sentiment erupted with a tidal wave of support. Polls surged. Editorials lauded her poise, her preparation, her ability to hold the Crown's dignity amid internal fracture. Even critics who had once questioned her quiet nature now saw it as strategic discipline. The nation didn't just accept her, they expected her. And in stark contrast, Camilla vanished. A brief palace memo stated she had retired to Balmoral indefinitely. No further explanation followed. It was a retreat wrapped in silence, one that many interpreted as the final acknowledgement of a power transition she could no longer obstruct. Behind the gates, the Queen Consort had become a figure of history, not of influence. And so, as the monarchy recalibrated around a new axis, Catherine's role was no longer one of slow evolution. It was one step from activation. The institution, so often burdened by the weight of its past, now revolved around the quiet strength of a woman long underestimated. But just as the palace began to stabilize under the architecture of this quiet revolution, one last echo from the shadows rose to the surface. A voice long gone, a message long buried about to rewrite everything Catherine thought she knew. But while the monarchy recalibrated under this quiet revolution, one final echo from the past was about to shake even Catherine to her core. In the final sealed envelope found beneath the Catherine clause, a handwritten letter addressed to "My granddaughter in duty" revealed the emotional cornerstone behind Elizabeth's choices. It spoke of legacy, resilience, and a woman's quiet war against the world's expectation. In it, Catherine found more than authority, she found purpose. The monarchy, at last, was hers to mould. The letter, its ink faded but steady, began not with regal tone but with something profoundly personal. Elizabeth wrote of watching Catherine for years across public engagements and private dinners, noting her silence, her restraint, her ability to command without ever raising her voice. She recalled the first time Catherine stood behind William, not as decoration, but as anchor. "They will never understand," the Queen wrote, "what it means to carry power while appearing not to seek it. That is your gift and your burden." The message delved into Elizabeth's private disillusionment. She confessed, in quiet terms, to moments of doubt about the monarchy's future of a system too rigid to adapt, too loyal to tradition, to protect its own evolution. She lamented the weight Charles had been made to carry, calling it a crown crafted from unmet expectations. She praised Anne's tireless service, acknowledging that much of it was done in shadows, uncelebrated, but irreplaceable. Then, with devastating clarity, she turned to Catherine, not as daughter-in-law, but as chosen steward. "You," the Queen wrote, "are to complete what I could not publicly begin. You will wear this house like armor, and in doing so, you will free it." Catherine, alone in her study, wept as she read. This was no mere endorsement, it was an inheritance of spirit, an unspoken coronation of trust. Her role was no longer an institutional placeholder. It was destiny carved in ink and sealed by the woman whose reign defined an age. The quiet strength Elizabeth had admired in her was no longer a hidden virtue. It had become the very foundation of royal renewal. The final lines of the letter struck like a bell tolling in the soul. "Wear the crown as if you earned it, because in every silent hour you did." Those words, simple yet seismic, altered Catherine's posture from that moment on. It was no longer about surviving court dynamics or navigating power plays. It was about legacy, continuity, and the responsibility to build something unshakable from within. And so began a new chapter, not just for Catherine, but for a monarchy reshaped in silence, secrecy, and strength. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.